August 14, 2024, the day Venezuela redrew the map of South America.
That was the date Nicolas Maduro's government published its new official map, one that now includes a vast swath of neighboring Guyana's territory, specifically, the Essequibo region, an area roughly the size of Florida, rich in oil, gold, and untapped mineral wealth.
At first glance, this might seem like just another territorial dispute, the kind that flares up periodically in post-colonial states with poorly defined borders. But if you think that's all this is, you're missing the bigger picture. Because what Venezuela has just done isn't just about Essequibo. It's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order, the death of American hegemony in its own backyard, and the opening moves of a new great power competition that will define the next decade. And if we don't understand what's really happening here, we're going to sleepwalk into a crisis far more dangerous than most people realize. I've spent the last 30 years studying the intersection of geopolitics, resource competition, and great power conflict, first as an analyst in the intelligence community, later as an academic, and now as someone who advises governments and corporations on how these forces shape the world. And let me tell what's unfolding in Venezuela right now is one of those rare moments when the tectonic plates of global power shift beneath our feet. The mainstream media is treating this as a local squabble, a footnote in the ongoing saga of Latin American instability. But that's not what this is. This is the first real test of whether the United States still has the will and the capability to enforce its vision of a unipolar world. And the early signs are not encouraging. So let's start with the official narrative, the story they want you to believe. Then we'll peel back the layers and see what's really going on. The official: a simple territorial dispute. On the surface, this looks straightforward. Venezuela has long claimed the Essequibo region, which makes up about 2/3 of Guyana's territory. The dispute dates back to the 19th century, when the British Empire drew the borders of its colony, British Guiana, in a way that Caracas has always considered illegitimate. In 1966, just before Guyana gained independence, the UK and Venezuela signed the Geneva Agreement, which called for a negotiated settlement. But progress stalled, and the issue faded into the background until 2015, when ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Guyanese waters. Suddenly, Essequibo wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a potential bonanza. Fast forward to 2023. Guyana, now one of the world's fastest-growing economies thanks to its oil boom, takes the dispute to the International Court of Justice. Venezuela, under Maduro, rejects the court's jurisdiction and instead holds a referendum in December 2023, where voters overwhelmingly approved the creation of a new Venezuelan state in Essequibo. The U.S. and its allies condemn the move as a violation of international law. The State Department issues statements reaffirming support for Guyana's territorial integrity. The OAS and the UN echo the same line. Case closed, right? But here's the problem with this: it assumes that Venezuela's actions are purely about Essequibo. That this is just another Latin American territorial spat, like the Falklands or Belize. That Maduro is acting out of desperation, lashing out because his economy is in shambles and he needs a nationalist distraction. And sure, there's some truth to that. But it's not the whole truth. Not even close. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the timing. Why now? Venezuela's economy has been in freefall for years. Maduro has survived sanctions, hyperinflation, and mass emigration. So why risk a major international crisis over Essequibo in 2024? The answer lies in three: oil, China, and multipolarity. First, the oil. Guyana's offshore fields are a game-changer. ExxonMobil and its partners have already discovered over 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil, with more likely to come. By 2027, Guyana could be producing over 1.2 million barrels per day, more than Venezuela at its peak. And here's the: most of that oil is light and sweet, the kind that's in high demand for refining into gasoline and diesel. In a world where OPEC Plus is cutting production and global spare capacity is dwindling, Guyana's oil is a strategic asset. Venezuela, which sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves but can't even produce 1 million barrels a day due to mismanagement and sanctions, sees this as an existential threat. If Guyana becomes an energy superpower, Venezuela's already diminished influence in global oil markets evaporates entirely. But it's not just about oil. It's about who controls it. And that brings us to China. Over the past decade, China has quietly become the dominant economic player in Latin America. It's the top trading partner for most of the region's major economies, including Brazil, Chile, and Peru.
It's financed infrastructure projects, bought up commodities, and extended billions in loans. And in Venezuela, it's done something even more: it's kept Maduro afloat. Despite U.S. sanctions, China has continued to buy Venezuelan oil, often at a discount, and has provided financial lifelines to Caracas. In return, Venezuela has become a key node in China's Belt and Road Initiative, hosting Chinese military advisors and even allowing Chinese commies to operate in sectors that were once off limits.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. In the months leading up to Venezuela's Essequibo gambit, there were unconfirmed reports, later corroborated by intelligence sources, that China had been pressuring Maduro to take a harder line on Guyana. Why? Because China has a vested interest in ensuring that Guyana's oil doesn't flow exclusively to Western commies like ExxonMobil. If Venezuela can disrupt Guyana's production either through direct action or by creating enough instability to scare off investors, China benefits. It can step in as the neutral mediator, offering to buy Guyana's oil at a discount or financing alternative pipelines that bypass Western-controlled infrastructure. But China isn't the only great power with skin in this game. Russia is also deeply involved.
In 2023, Maduro signed a deal with Rosneft to develop Venezuela's oil fields, effectively handing Moscow a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Russia has also provided military support to Caracas, including advanced air defense systems and training for Venezuelan special forces.
And let's not forget that Russia has its own reasons for wanting to see the US distracted in its own backyard. Every American dollar and diplomatic resource spent managing a crisis in South America is one less available for Ukraine or the Indo-Pacific. So when Maduro published that new map in August 2024, it wasn't just a nationalist stunt. It was a calculated move, one that had been greenlit, or at least tacitly approved, by Caracas' great power patrons. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Because this isn't just Venezuela acting alone. It's Venezuela acting as a proxy for a much larger geopolitical struggle. The broader geopolitical, the death of unipolarity. To understand why this matters, we need to out. For the past 3 decades, the United States has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, the idea that it is the sole superpower, capable of shaping the international order in its image. This was the logic behind NATO action, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the pivot to Asia. It was the driving force behind the rules-based international order, a euphemism for a system where Washington sets the rules and everyone else plays by them. But that world is gone. And Venezuela's move on Essequibo is just the latest sign of its demise. We're now in an era of multipolar competition, where 3 great powers, the US, China, and Russia, vie for influence in a world where no single country can dominate. This isn't just about military power, it's about economics, technology, and the ability to shape the global financial system. And in this new world, the old rules don't apply. Spheres of influence are back. Alliances are fluid. And the US is no longer the only game in town. Let's look at the historical parallels. During the Cold War, Latin America was a battleground between the US and the Soviet Union. The Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere was America's exclusive domain, was sacrosanct. Any attempt by a foreign power to gain a foothold in the region was met with swift and decisive action. The Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the overthrow of Allende in Chile, these were all manifestations of this zero-sum competition. But today, the US no longer has the same leverage. China is the top trading partner for most of Latin America. Russia has military bases in Nicaragua and Venezuela. Iran has deepened ties with Bolivia and Venezuela. And the US? It's bogged down in Ukraine, distracted by the Indo-Pacific, and increasingly polarized at home. The result is a power vacuum, and one that revisionist states are more than happy to fill. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The US has spent the last 2 decades lecturing the world about the importance of international law, sovereignty, and the inviolability of borders. But when it comes to Venezuela's aggression against Guyana, Washington's response has been muted. There have been statements of support for Guyana, sure. But no red lines. No threats of military action. No sanctions on Venezuela's oil exports to China. Why? Because the US is caught in a trap of its own making. On one hand, the Biden administration can't afford another foreign policy crisis. With elections looming and the public weary of endless wars, the political appetite for confrontation is non-existent. On the other hand, if the US does nothing, it sends a message to every revisionist state in the Monroe Doctrine is dead. You can challenge American hegemony in its own backyard and get away with it. This is the paradox of unipolarity in decline. The US still has the military and economic power to enforce its will. But it no longer has the political will or the domestic consensus to do so. And that's why Venezuela's move is so dangerous. Because it's not just about Essequibo. It's about testing the limits of American power. And if Maduro gets away with this, it won't be the last time we see this kind of challenge. Military and strategic, the illusion of a quick fix. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get really dicey. Guyana has no standing army to speak of. Its military is tiny, poorly equipped, and entirely unprepared for a conventional conflict. Venezuela, by contrast, has one of the largest militaries in Latin America, with over 120,000 active duty personnel, advanced Russian air defense systems, and a navy that, while outdated, could still project power in the region. On paper, this looks like a mismatch. But as we've learned from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, paper advantages don't always translate into real-world success. The US has already started to respond. In late 2023, the Pentagon conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, including air and naval drills. In early 2024, the U.S. Southern Command announced the deployment of additional assets to the region, including surveillance drones and a small contingent of Special Forces advisors. The message was the U.S. is drawing a line in the sand. But here's the military deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to use force. And right now, Maduro doesn't believe that. Why? Because he's seen the U.S. back down before. In 2019, the Trump administration came close to launching a military intervention in Venezuela. National Security Advisor John Bolton was pushing for regime change. The U.S. recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president. There were even reports of a covert operation to capture Maduro. But in the end, nothing happened. The U.S. blinked. And Maduro learned a valuable: as long as he has the backing of China and Russia, he can call Washington's bluff. Now, fast forward to 2024. Maduro knows that the U.S. is even more reluctant to use force. The Biden administration is focused on Ukraine and Taiwan. The American public is exhausted by foreign entanglements. And the political risks of another Latin American intervention are simply too high. So when Maduro looks at the U.S. response to Essequibo, he sees weakness. And weakness, in the world of geopolitics, is an invitation to aggression. But let's say the U.S. does decide to escalate. What are the options? Option 1: limited strikes. The U.S. could conduct airstrikes against Venezuelan military targets, degrading its air defenses and naval assets. This would send a message without committing to a full-scale invasion. But it's also incredibly risky. Venezuela has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, which could shoot down American aircraft. And even if the strikes are successful, Maduro could retaliate by attacking U.S. interests in the region: embassies, oil installations, or even American citizens. Option 2: naval blockade. The U.S. could impose a blockade on Venezuela's oil exports, cutting off its main source of revenue. This would cripple Maduro's regime economically. But it would also hurt China and India, which are major buyers of Venezuelan oil. And in a multipolar world, that's a non-starter. China would almost certainly retaliate by increasing its purchases of Iranian oil, further undermining U.S. sanctions. And Russia could escalate in Ukraine or the Middle East, creating a cascade of crises that the U.S. can't handle. Option 3: regime change. The U.S. could double down on its support for the Venezuelan opposition, providing them with weapons and training to overthrow Maduro. But this is a long shot. The opposition is fractured. The military remains loyal to Maduro. And even if he were toppled, there's no guarantee that his successor would be any better. Look at Libya after Gaddafi. Look at Iraq after Saddam. Regime change is messy, unpredictable, and often makes things worse. Now, I'm not saying the US should do nothing. But we need to be realistic about the costs and consequences of military action. The hawks in Washington who think this can be resolved with a few airstrikes are living in a fantasy world. Venezuela isn't Grenada. It's not AMA. It's a country with a large, battle-hardened military, powerful foreign backers, and a leader who has nothing to lose. And if the US gets dragged into a prolonged conflict in South America, it will be a disaster for the region, for American credibility, and for global stability. The domestic political why this matters in Florida. But this isn't just about geopolitics. It's also about domestic politics. And in the US, that means one Florida. Venezuela's move on Essequibo has become a major issue in the 2024 presidential election. And for good reason. Florida is home to over 200,000 Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. They're a powerful voting bloc, and they're demanding action. Both Biden and Trump have seized on the issue, trying to out-hawk each other in their condemnations of Maduro. But here's the neither candidate is being honest about the trade-offs. Biden is trying to thread the needle, supporting Guyana without provoking a wider conflict. Trump, meanwhile, is taking a harder line, promising to crush Maduro if elected. But neither is explaining to the American people what that actually means. Because the truth is, there are no good options here. Every path forward comes with serious risks. And that's the real danger of domestic politics distorting foreign policy. When you're in an election year, the temptation to score cheap points is overwhelming. But in geopolitics, cheap points can lead to expensive wars. And if the US stumbles into a conflict with Venezuela because of electoral calculations, it will be a disaster. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1: controlled escalation. In this scenario, Venezuela stops short of a full-scale invasion but continues to apply pressure through hybrid warfare. It could send civilian settlers into Essequibo, establish a de facto presence, and use legal and diplomatic means to challenge Guyana's sovereignty. The US responds with sanctions, military exercises, and increased support for Guyana's military. China and Russia provide just enough backing to keep Maduro in power, but not enough to provoke a direct confrontation with the US. The result is a frozen conflict, one that simmers for years, draining resources and attention from both sides. This is the most likely outcome. It's messy, but it avoids a full-blown war. The downside? It sets a dangerous precedent. If Venezuela can get away with this, other revisionist states will follow suit. And the US will look weak. Scenario 2: direct confrontation. In this scenario, Venezuela crosses the Rubicon. It invades Essequibo, either through a full-scale military operation or a limited incursion to seize key oil installations. The US responds with airstrikes, a naval blockade, or even a limited ground operation to push Venezuelan forces back. China and Russia condemn the US but stop short of direct military intervention. The conflict escalates into a regional crisis, with Colombia, Brazil, and other Latin American states forced to pick sides. This is the nightmare scenario. It would be a disaster for the region, for global energy markets, and for American credibility. And the worst part? It's entirely avoidable. But if the US continues to send mixed signals, it becomes more likely. Scenario 3: diplomatic resolution. In this scenario, cooler heads prevail. The US, China, and Russia broker a deal where Venezuela drops its claim to Essequibo in exchange for sanctions relief and economic aid. Guyana agrees to share some of its oil revenue with Venezuela, and the US offers security guarantees to both countries. The ICJ rules in Guyana's favor, but the decision is accepted by all parties. This is the best-case scenario. But it's also the least likely. Why? Because it requires Maduro to back down, a move that would undermine his domestic legitimacy. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana, it's a microcosm of a much larger geopolitical shift. The real story here isn't the oil, though that's certainly a factor.
It's about the erosion of the post-Cold War order in Latin America and the way great powers are testing the limits of American influence in what Washington has long considered its backyard. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines. First, there's the military dimension. The US has spent decades treating Latin America as a secondary theater, assuming that its dominance in the region was unassailable. But that assumption is being challenged in real time. Venezuela's military, despite its decay, remains one of the most capable in South America, thanks in no small part to Russian and Chinese support. Since 2006, Moscow has sold Caracas over $11 billion in arms, including Sukhoi fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. China, meanwhile, has provided surveillance drones, radar systems, and even helped Venezuela develop its own ballistic missile program.
This isn't just about hardware, it's about doctrine. Venezuela's military has been trained in asymmetric warfare tactics, the kind designed to counter US power projection. The Russians call it hybrid warfare, a mix of conventional forces, irregular proxies, and cyber operations. The Chinese call it unrestricted warfare. Whatever you call it, it's a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is not prepared for a serious military confrontation in Latin America. The Southern Command has been chronically underfunded, with its budget cut by nearly 40% since 2010. The U.S. Navy's Fourth Fleet, responsible for the region, has just a handful of ships at any given time. And while the U.S. still maintains a network of bases, from Guantanamo to Soto Cano in Honduras, many of these are relics of the Cold War, not designed for modern warfare. Compare that to China's growing fleet. Beijing has invested heavily in dual-use infrastructure across the region, from deep-water ports in AMA and the Bahamas to space tracking stations in Argentina. These aren't just commercial projects, they're strategic assets. And Russia?
It's already shown it can project power into the Western Hemisphere, as it did in 2019 when it sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela.
Now, let's talk about the regional response. If Venezuela invades Essequibo, the US will have to rely on its allies to contain the crisis.
But here's those allies are divided. Brazil, under Lula, has tried to position itself as a neutral mediator, but its military is deeply concerned about Venezuela's instability spilling over its northern border. Colombia, a key U.S. partner, is focused on its own internal conflicts and doesn't want to get dragged into a war with Venezuela. And then there's Cuba, which has been Venezuela's closest ally since the days of Chavez. Havana provides intelligence, advisors, and even troops, yes, Cuban troops, to prop up Maduro's regime.
If the U.S. moves against Venezuela, Cuba will be in the crosshairs.
And that's a scenario Washington wants to avoid, given the political sensitivity of U.S.-Cuba relations. This brings me to the broader strategic implications. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades focused on the Middle East and, more recently, the Indo-Pacific.
Latin America was supposed to be stable.
But now, it's becoming a battleground for great power competition.
China sees the region as a critical source of raw materials and a market for its Belt and Road Initiative. Russia sees it as a way to distract and weaken the US. And the US? It's still trying to figure out its own strategy.
The Biden administration's approach has been a mix of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and occasional military exercises like the recent joint drills with Guyana.
But sanctions alone won't stop Maduro.
And military exercises, while useful for signaling, won't deter an invasion if Maduro believes he can get away with it.
Let me give you a historical parallel.
In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, gambling that Britain wouldn't respond.
It was a miscalculation that cost Argentina dearly. But what if Argentina had had a nuclear-armed patron like Russia or China backing it? The calculus would have been very different.
That's the situation Venezuela finds itself in today.
Maduro knows that if he moves against Essequibo, he'll face US sanctions and condemnation.
But he also knows that China and Russia will shield him from the worst consequences. That's why the most likely outcome is a frozen conflict, because neither side has an incentive to escalate, but neither side has an incentive to back down either.
Here's what keeps me up at night. The US has spent the last 30 years assuming that its dominance in Latin America was permanent. But that dominance was never as absolute as Washington thought. The region is changing, and the US is struggling to adapt. If Venezuela gets away with annexing Essequibo, even through a creeping, hybrid campaign, it will send a message to every revisionist state in that the rules don't apply to you if you have powerful friends. And that's a message that could destabilize not just Latin America, but the entire global order. Now, what most people don't realize is that Maduro's gamble isn't just about Essequibo, it's about survival. The Venezuelan regime is a zombie state, propped up by repression, corruption, and the sheer exhaustion of its people. The economy has contracted by over 75% since 2013, according to the IMF. Hyperinflation peaked at 1 million% in 2018. More than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, Maduro is still standing. How? Because he's mastered the art of political jiu-jitsu, turning weakness into leverage. Let me explain why this matters. The regime's legitimacy is paper-thin.
The 2018 presidential election was widely condemned as fraudulent by the US, the EU, and the Lima Group. Juan Guaidó, the opposition leader recognized by over 50 countries as Venezuela's interim president, was sidelined after a failed uprising in 2019. Since then, the opposition has fractured, with some factions boycotting elections, others participating, and a few even negotiating with the government.
The result?
A political landscape so fragmented that Maduro can claim a veneer of democratic legitimacy while systematically dismantling any real challenge to his power. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro doesn't need to win a fair election to stay in power.
He just needs to make sure no one else can. And that's where Essequibo comes in. The referendum on December 3 wasn't just about territorial claims, it was a domestic power play. By rallying nationalist sentiment around a perceived external threat, Maduro is trying to paper over the cracks in his regime. It's a classic authoritarian: create a crisis, then present yourself as the only one who can solve it. But there's a catch. The referendum results were almost comically inflated. The government claimed over 10 million votes in favor, but independent observers noted that turnout was suspiciously low, likely less than 30% of eligible voters. Even more telling, the opposition-controlled National Assembly, which still holds some legitimacy, rejected the referendum as unconstitutional. So why did Maduro push it? Because he needed a win, any win, to justify his next move. That next move could take several forms. The most likely scenario is a creeping annexation, what I call the Crimea model. Venezuela could establish a military presence in Essequibo without a full-scale invasion, using hybrid tactics like cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and proxy forces to destabilize Guyana. They've already set the stage. In October, Maduro's government arrested 3 Guyanese fishermen in disputed waters, escalating tensions. Then, in November, they announced plans to grant oil licenses in Essequibo's offshore blocks, directly challenging Guyana's sovereignty.
These are the kind of salami-slice tactics that make it hard for the US or the international community to respond decisively. But here's where it gets really dangerous. If Maduro overplays his hand, say, by sending troops into Essequibo, he risks triggering a regional crisis that could spiral out of control. Guyana has no military to speak of, but it has powerful allies. The US has already conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, and Brazil, which shares a border with both countries, has warned Venezuela against any unilateral action. Brazil's President Lula da Silva, who has tried to position himself as a mediator, has walked a fine line, condemning Venezuela's aggression while avoiding outright confrontation. But if Venezuelan troops cross the border, Lula will have no choice but to respond, if only to protect Brazil's own interests in the Amazon. Now, let's talk about the opposition. The Venezuelan opposition is in disarray, but that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. The most significant development in recent months has been the return of Maria Corina Machado, a hardline anti-Chavista leader who won the opposition's primary in October with over 90% of the vote. Machado is a polarizing figure. She's been banned from running for office, and her confrontational style has alienated some moderates. But her popularity is undeniable. She represents the first real challenge to Maduro's narrative that the opposition is weak and divided.
Maduro's response has been repression.
Machado has been barred from holding public office, and her campaign events have been disrupted by pro-government thugs. But here's the thing: Maduro can't afford to let her run in the 2024 presidential election, but he also can't afford to ignore her.
If he cracks down too hard, he risks alienating even his own base.
If he allows her to participate, he risks losing. It's a classic authoritarian dilemma, and it's one that could push him toward even more aggressive foreign adventurism to distract from domestic unrest.
Let me give you a historical parallel.
In 1982, Argentina's military junta invaded the Falklands to distract from economic collapse and political unrest at home. It was a desperate gamble, and it failed spectacularly.
But what if the junta had had a nuclear-armed patron? What if they had been able to frame the conflict as a struggle against imperialism, rather than a naked power grab? That's the situation Maduro finds himself in today. He's not just gambling on Essequibo, he's gambling on the idea that the US and its allies won't risk a larger confrontation with Russia and China over a small, resource-rich territory in South America.
Here's what I think will happen, and Maduro will continue to escalate tensions, but he'll stop short of a full-scale invasion. Instead, he'll use hybrid tactics, cyber attacks, disinformation, proxy forces to wear down Guyana and test the resolve of the US and its allies. He'll also use the crisis to justify further repression at home, cracking down on the opposition and consolidating his power. The goal isn't to win a war, it's to create a frozen conflict that he can use to rally support and distract from his domestic failures. But there's a wild card: the Venezuelan military. The armed forces are the backbone of the regime, but they're also a potential source of instability. The military has been hit hard by the economic crisis, and there have been reports of low morale and defections. If Maduro pushes too far, if he orders an invasion that leads to heavy casualties or a humiliating defeat, the military could turn on him.
That's why I think he'll avoid a direct confrontation.
He'll keep the pressure on, but he won't risk everything on a single roll of the dice.
The real danger isn't just that Maduro will get away with annexing Essequibo. It's that his success will embolden other revisionist states to challenge the status quo. If Venezuela can redraw borders with impunity, why can't Nicaragua try to reclaim the Mosquito Coast? Why can't Bolivia push harder for access to the Pacific? Why can't Russia or China use similar tactics in their own spheres of influence? That's the message, Maduro, is the rules don't apply to you if you have powerful friends and a willingness to break them. And that's why this matters far beyond Venezuela. The US has spent decades assuming that Latin America was a stable, US-dominated region. But that stability was always more fragile than it seemed. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the erosion of US influence have created a new geopolitical reality, one where small states can punch above their weight if they have the right patrons. Venezuela is just the first test. If Maduro gets away with this, it won't be the last. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of a post-Cold War order that Washington took for granted. For decades, the US operated under the assumption that Latin America was a backyard where the rules were set in Washington, enforced by the OAS, and policed by the occasional military intervention or coup when things got too messy. But that world is gone, and Maduro's gambit is a direct challenge to the last remnants of that system. The uncomfortable truth is that the US no longer has the leverage it once did. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and no one in the region is mourning its passing. Let me explain why this matters in the broader context of grand strategy. The US has spent the last 30 years pivoting toward Asia, treating Latin America as an afterthought. The result? A region where China now accounts for nearly 20% of total trade, up from just 2% in 2000. Russia has reinserted itself as a security partner, selling arms to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and even Bolivia. And Iran has made inroads, using Venezuela as a staging ground for its own regional ambitions. The US still has military bases in Colombia and Honduras, but its soft power is in tatters. The Biden administration's response to the Essequibo crisis has been tepid at best: condemnations, sanctions, and a show of naval force that looks more like a symbolic gesture than a real deterrent. That's not because the US lacks the capability to act, but because it lacks the will. And in geopolitics, weakness is provocative. Here's the Maduro isn't operating in a vacuum. He's taking cues from Putin's playbook in Ukraine and China's in the South China Sea. The message is clear: if you have a patron willing to shield you from consequences, you can rewrite the rules. The problem for the US is that its toolkit is outdated. Sanctions? Venezuela has been under them for years, and it's only made Maduro more dependent on Russia and China. Military threats? The US public has no appetite for another intervention in Latin America, and the Pentagon is stretched thin between Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific. Diplomacy? The OAS is divided, and the UN is paralyzed by Russian and Chinese vetoes. So what's left? A lot of tough talk and not much else. But there are alternatives if Washington is willing to think creatively. The first is to recognize that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Maduro, it's about the collapse of the Venezuelan state. The country's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013, inflation is in the millions of percent, and over 7 million people have fled. That's not a regime that can sustain a prolonged conflict. The US could exploit this by offering a clear-off sanctions relief in exchange for a negotiated withdrawal from Essequibo and a return to democratic norms. It's not pretty, but neither is the alternative. The second is to work with regional partners to isolate Venezuela economically. Guyana is already moving in that direction, but it needs support. The US could help by pressuring European banks to cut off Venezuelan access to the financial system and by working with Brazil and Colombia to enforce a de facto blockade on Venezuelan oil exports. The third is to prepare for the worst. If Maduro does order an invasion, the US needs to be ready to respond with overwhelming force, not to occupy Venezuela, but to make the cost of aggression unbearable. That means pre-positioning assets in the region, working with allies to impose a naval quarantine, and making it clear that any attack on Guyana will be treated as an attack on US interests. The bigger question, though, is whether the US is willing to accept that Latin America is no longer its exclusive sphere of influence. For decades, Washington treated the region as a place where it could intervene at will, overthrow governments, and install dictators without consequence. That era is over. The rise of China and Russia has given Latin American states new options, and they're not going to give them up without a fight. The US can either adapt or watch as its influence erodes further. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's move is a test, and the US is failing it. If he gets away with this, it won't just be Guyana that pays the price. It'll be every small state in the region that finds itself in the crosshairs of a revisionist power. And it'll be the US that wakes up one day to find that its backyard is no longer its own. The question isn't whether the US can stop Venezuela, it's whether it even wants to. And right now, the answer isn't clear. In the end, this isn't just about a piece of land. It's about whether the rules-based order still means anything in a world where the rules are being rewritten by those who never believed in them in the first place. Maduro is betting that it doesn't. The US needs to prove him wrong.